Again, I welcome you today. I thank you for coming. My name is Phil Pignatelli. Many of you look familiar to me. Some of you don't look familiar to me, but again, I welcome all of you. The title of my lecture is Freud's Lessons, and specifically, what I'll be trying to do today is to provide an examination of Freud's life, his ideas, and his value to us. Sigmund Freud is considered by many to be one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century. In fact, his supporters claim he was a great thinker. He has his detractors, of course, as well, and we will be talking about both of them today and in 2 weeks when I provide part 2 of the lecture. Freud is thought-provoking, he's controversial, and he's influential. You hear people, perhaps you yourself have used the expression, let's get beneath the surface, or more than meets the eye. When people use expressions such as those, let's get beneath the surface, or more than meets the eye, they're really, in a certain sense, talking Freud. His value today is debated. I mentioned to you that there are people who are very enthusiastic supporters of Freud. There are people in the academic community who are convinced that he was one of the great thinkers of this century. But I mentioned he also has his detractors. And one cannot lecture on Freud without pointing that out, that his ideas have not been set in concrete, that much of what he said, much of what he wrote is controversial. One of the important questions that is raised when one talks about Sigmund Freud is this. Should Freud be considered primarily as a scientist in the tradition, for example, of Charles Darwin? Or should Freud be considered more in the tradition of a Plato? Should Freud be considered more of a philosopher than a scientist? Or perhaps, a third option, should Freud be considered more as a man of letters, more in the tradition of Montaigne or Shakespeare? Harold Bloom, perhaps the best-read professor in America, teaches at NYU, teaches at Yale, has written a book on the Western canon in which he talks about which books he believes to be the great books in the Western canon, and which writers he believes to be the greatest writers who ever lived, writers in the Western tradition. And he claims that Freud rates right up there as one of the great essayists of all time, one of the great essayists of all time. And he compares Freud to Montaigne and the American Ralph Waldo Emerson. And if you have read Freud, you know that so many of his books really are long essays, that so many of his books do not run more than 150, 200 pages. And one of the things perhaps you can think about today as I'm lecturing about Freud is whether you think, again, he should be regarded more as a scientist or a philosopher or a man of letters. My purpose today is to provide an overview of his life and his ideas and his value to us, so that when you leave today, if you don't have much knowledge of Freud, that you will have a basic understanding of what he believed and what he taught. And if you do know something about Freud, and I'm sure there are many of you here who already know something about Freud, I hope that I can enrich what you already know and perhaps stimulate your thinking. Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia. Moravia is now a part of the Czech Republic. When he was approximately 4 years old, shortly before his 4th birthday, the family moved to Vienna, Austria. And it was in Vienna, Austria that Freud lived almost his entire life. Freud earned his medical degree in 1881 from the University of Vienna. And it is interesting that in his autobiography, and I highly recommend that you read his autobiography, it's a rather short book. It's only about 150 to 200 pages. In fact, Freud entitled it, at least the English title, is Autobiographical Sketch. In any event, in his autobiography, Freud talks about his days at the University of Vienna and some of the discrimination that he experienced because he was a Jew. He started at the University of Vienna, by the way, at age 17. He had been a superb student in secondary school. In fact, he was first in his class virtually every year, I think every year in secondary school. And at age 17, again, he entered the University of Vienna. Let me just quote you a very short passage from his autobiography in which he talks about the discrimination he experienced there because he was a Jew, and also a lesson he learned from the discrimination. If you know anything about Freud, you know that he always tried to learn something from an adverse situation, and he felt that he did learn something from discrimination. Here are his own words, Freud's own words, as written in his autobiography. He says this, again, this is about his days at the University of Vienna. I was expected to feel myself inferior and an alien because I was a Jew. I refused absolutely to do the first of these things. I put up without much regret with my non-acceptance into the community. These first impressions at the university, however, had one consequence which afterwards was to prove important. For at an early age, I was made familiar with the fate of being put under the ban of the compact majority. Again, I was made at an early age familiar with the fate of being put under the ban of the compact majority. The foundations were thus laid for a certain degree of independence of judgment. So what Freud is saying, in effect, is he came to see at age 17 how foolishly people were behaving, that they were discriminating against him only because he was a Jew. There was no other reason for the discrimination. And of course, he found this to be irrational. And therefore, he came to the conclusion that the majority was wrong, and he indicates in this area of his autobiography, and later on also, that it helped him in life to question the majority, and that one of the most important things he ever learned in life was to question authority, to question the majority, because he became convinced that so often the majority is wrong, that so often so-called authority is wrong. And Freud, as you know, for so much of his life, was an iconoclast. In 1886, at age 30, Freud married Martha Benes. And from one particular standpoint, it was a very strange marriage for this reason. Freud was a committed atheist, a principled atheist, as biographer Peter Gay says. Whereas Martha Benes was an Orthodox Jew, and she came from a very pious Jewish family. Peter Gay has written what is generally considered to be the best single-volume biography of Freud. Peter Gay is professor emeritus at Yale, and the book, by the way, was published in 1988. It's called Freud, A Life for Our Time. And Professor Gay, in his biography, says this about Freud's marriage to an Orthodox Jew. And I'm quoting Professor Gay. Martha Benes had grown up in a strictly observant Orthodox Jewish family and accepted its pieties. Freud was a principled atheist, determined to win his bride away from all that superstitious nonsense. And by the way, when Gay says superstitious nonsense, that's not Gay's take on being an Orthodox Jew, that's Freud's take on being an Orthodox Jew. The Freuds had 6 children in 9 years. 6 children in 9 years. I mentioned to you they had a 53-year marriage. Sigmund Freud died in 1939, and his wife survived him. What I'd like to do now is to zero in on his professional life, specifically right now on his early career. After getting his medical degree from the University of Vienna, Freud moved to Paris for a time, and moved to Paris to train with a world-famous neurologist, Dr. Charcot. And there, Freud engaged in a serious study of brain anatomy. And when Freud returned from Paris in the mid-1880s, he married and then set up his practice in Vienna as a neurologist. That was Freud's specialty. He was a medical doctor whose specialty was neurology. But the thing he was most interested in doing as a neurologist was treating people who were emotionally disturbed. Early on, that's what he wanted to do, to treat emotionally disturbed people. And his main treatment for several years, his main approach to trying to help emotionally disturbed people was hypnosis. And in those days, hypnosis was the standard treatment. But Freud came to the conclusion that hypnosis was pretty ineffective. So then he experimented with what was then called the talking cure. And he came to the conclusion that talking to his patients and exploring their problems in conversation was a much better way to help people deal with their problems than was hypnosis. He came to the conclusion that hypnosis dealt reasonably well with the symptoms, but not with the real cause of the neurosis, whereas a conversation could get to the real cause of the neurosis. In his treatment of emotionally disturbed people, Freud came to the conclusion that neurosis was usually, if not always, related to sex in some way or another. So that he came to the conclusion that if someone were very depressed, or if somebody was suffering from compulsive behavior, or if somebody was very anxious, that in one way or another, this was related to sex. And let me give you a quote from Freud, because I'd like you to hear his own words on the connection between neurosis and sex. And these words were written by Freud in his autobiography. My investigation of the causes of the neuroses led me more and more frequently to conflicts between the subject's sexual impulses and his resistances to sexuality. So on the one hand, he found his patients had sexual impulses, as most, if not all of us do, but on the other hand, they had resistances to expressing their sexuality. And Freud came to the conclusion that these resistances were causing neuroses. And he said that the conflicts, the inner conflicts people often experienced concerning sex were often unconscious, that people often were unaware of the fact they were suffering conflicts about sex. Freud talks at length about this in his main book on sex. If you want a detailed account of what Freud believed about sexuality, the place to go is a book I think is a great book. It's considered one of Freud's outstanding works. It's called 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. In any event, in the 3 essays on sexuality, Freud says this: sexual instinct has to struggle against resistances, of which shame and disgust are the most prominent. So again, he's saying shame and disgust are the most prominent resistances to sexuality. He goes on to say, neurotic symptoms are in their essence substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. I'll say it again. These are Freud's own words. Neurotic symptoms are in their essence substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. Now you might wonder, how do dreams fit in here? Most of you, I think, are acquainted with the fact that Freud attached much importance to dreams. And as I said early on, I realize some of you here know a lot about Freud, and some of you here don't know much about Freud. So let me provide some basic information here about Freud's, about the connection that Freud drew between dreams and neurotic behavior. Freud wrote a very famous book, perhaps his most famous book, on the subject of dreams. He wrote it in 1900. It's called The Interpretation of Dreams. I don't suggest you read it, and I'll tell you why. It's a very difficult book. However, he wrote another book about a year later called On Dreams, which is the book you should read It's in paperback. It's very easy to buy. Any good bookstore has it. And what Freud did in the second book on dreams, he tried to provide a more lucid expression of the ideas he had presented in the interpretation of dreams, because he had found out that a lot of people were having difficulty understanding the book. So while the interpretation of dreams is probably his most famous book and the book that made him famous, nevertheless, I suggest that if you want Freud's own words on dreams, you go to his shorter work. It's a very fine book, a very lucid presentation called On Dreams. I'll take questions a little later on. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud says this, and this is a classic quote from him: "Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. The proper interpretation of dreams will help us sort out conflicts in our unconscious life." Again, Freud believed that so many of the conflicts we experience in life we're not really conscious of. These conflicts are going on in our unconscious. And Freud believed that if you were to sit down with someone who is a master at dream interpretation, and you were to tell that person your dreams, that person could help you through your dreams to sort out the conflicts and help you to achieve more tranquility and hopefully greater happiness. But I must tell you, if you think that after you read this book on dreams, that you will be able to interpret your own dreams, that you are probably working under an illusion, that you will need professional help. You will need professional help to interpret your dreams. One cannot talk about Freudian psychology without talking about the Oedipus complex. So let me very briefly talk about this aspect of Freudian psychology. The Oedipus complex, in short, is an unconscious sexual desire in a child, especially a male, for the parent of the opposite sex. That Freud believed that it is a universal experience that all boys lust for their mothers. All boys lust for their mothers. Some are aware of it, some aren't aware of it. And when boys develop this lust for their mother, they also develop a hostility towards the father. Freud also believed that young girls also experience the Oedipus complex, but in a somewhat different way. And Freud talks in much more detail about the Oedipus complex in boys than in girls. In fact, Freud, even in his late days on this planet, said he understood males better than he understood females. And 2 weeks from now, when I talk about Freud's relationship to women, I will spend about 10 minutes talking about that. In any event, you might wonder, how does the Oedipus complex, this lust for the mother, hostility towards the father, how does this fit in with developing a neurosis, a mental problem, mental disorder? Well, Freud believed that when the boy lusted for his mother and was angry at his father, that this led to an inner conflict, it led to fear, and it led to guilt. And the combination of the conflict, the fear, and the guilt that the little boy experienced, some of this unconsciously, could, in adulthood, if the Oedipus complex was not resolved, if the Oedipus complex was not resolved, this in adulthood could lead to a neurosis. What I'd like to do now is to talk about Freud's view of adult sexuality. Again, the Oedipus complex has to deal with children. And Freud often wrote and spoke about childhood sexuality, but I don't want to get into that today. Time will not permit. So let me talk about adult sexuality. Freud believed that sadism and aggression in erotic relationships are not at all unusual. Allow me to say that again. Freud believed that sadism and aggression in erotic relationships are not at all unusual. You probably know that Freud had some very strong ideas about human nature, and one of the adjectives he used time and again to describe human beings, both male and female, was aggressive. Freud believed that we are innately aggressive. We came out of the womb aggressive. And in Civilization and its Discontents, Freud says that human beings are not gentle creatures by nature. Human beings by nature are not gentle creatures. human beings by nature are aggressive creatures. And he believed that World War I, the brutality of World War I, proved his thesis, that he saw World War I, in a sense, as confirmation of some of the ideas he had taught about human nature. Let me go back to these elements of human sexuality: sadism and aggression. Here's what Freud said about sadism, and I'm quoting him. Sadism has long been known as a component instinct of sexuality. Sadism has long since been known as a component instinct of sexuality. With regard to aggression, he says this, and I'm quoting him: the sexuality of most male human beings contains an element of aggressiveness, a desire to subjugate. Let me say that again. I'm surprised some women haven't turned to their husbands and looked at them in a certain way. Again, he says, the sexuality of most male human beings contains an element of aggressiveness, a desire to subjugate. Freud also believed that when it comes to sex, people do a lot of lying. That perhaps it wasn't just Bill Clinton who might have told some fibs about his own sex life. Freud believed that one of the most common lies, or one of the most common kinds of lying people engage in, is lying about sex, either in expressing an attitude to somebody that they might or might not have about sex, or just in talking about sex in general. That Freud believed that people are very circumspect and don't expect to get much honesty from people concerning what they really believe about sex. Freud also believed that our sexual desires can never be fully satisfied. Isn't that a disappointment? Our sexual desires can never be fully satisfied. And if you didn't hear that comment from Norman, he said, now you tell me. Norman's been married for many years. These unsatisfied desires find expression in surprising, sometimes disturbing ways. Again, we can become frustrated because our sexual desires are not completely satisfied. And among the results of the frustration, according to Freud, very often are nervousness and increased aggressiveness. So if somebody told you when you were a teenager that people can become very nervous or even very aggressive if they're sexually frustrated, Freud would say, right on. But then again, Freud would add the caveat that it's probably true that all human beings are somewhat sexually frustrated. Freud spoke and wrote a lot about the importance of sublimation. In fact, Freud's own life might be a good example of sublimation. Freud believed in talking about sex and in living sex that it was extremely important that we channel a lot of our sexual energy into other areas. Freud believed that when Mozart composed, that Mozart was using a lot of his sexual energy to compose great music. Freud believed that when great writers write great books, they're using a lot of sexual energy to write. Freud also believed that when great teachers teach, they're using a lot of their sexual energy to teach. And you might conclude today, if this lecture doesn't go well, that maybe there's some connection between what Freud is saying and my lecture. Freud believed it was essential that we accept the idea that our sexual desires will never be completely satisfied, and therefore that we try to channel a lot of our sexual energy into our jobs, into loving people, being of service to people, that this is extremely, extremely important. He went on to say, in a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, that civilization is both good for people and bad for people. He says we need civilization in that we need laws to restrain people's innate aggressiveness. But by the same token, civilization frustrates us because we would like to express a lot of that aggressiveness, which civilization doesn't allow us to express unless we're willing to pay certain penalties, such as being confined to a prison. And Freud is rather specific in talking about some of the restrictions that civilization imposes on us. He talks about taboos, societal taboos such as those against incest. He talks about laws, laws such as age of consent laws, laws against sexual assaults. He talks about customs. The custom, for example, which I think virtually every Western European country had, concerning legitimacy, monogamy, that Western societies were teaching people they should be monogamous and they should not have children out of wedlock. And Freud believed this in one way or another. Some people felt to be frustrating. And in fact, Freud went on in some detail to talk very specifically about some of the restrictions in his part of the world. He mentioned that in Western Europe, only heterosexual sex was condoned. Only heterosexual sex was condoned. And he said that in his part of the world, most extragenital satisfactions were forbidden as perversions. Most extragenital satisfactions were forbidden as perversions. And he said that in Western Europe, a single kind of sex life was required for all. A single kind of sex life was required for all. Freud believed this to be a great injustice, to demand, that society demand, that everybody have the same kind of sex life. And of course, as I indicated before, in Western Europe there was an emphasis on monogamy and legitimacy. Now it is interesting, so many of the restrictions that Western European countries such as Austria and Germany had on sexual behavior, they no longer have. So many of the restrictions our culture once imposed on sexual behavior, our culture no longer imposes. For example, I think it's safe to say that today there is little or no stigma to illegitimacy. I think it's safe to say that in Western Europe and in the United States, many women who are not married give birth, and they and their relatives and friends and acquaintances feel there's nothing wrong with that. Also, I think it's safe to say that living together without being married is a quite different situation today than when Freud was alive. When he was alive, I think we can be confident that many people attached a stigma to that. Now in Western Europe and the United States, again, few people, I think it's safe to say, attach any stigma to that. And of course, when Freud was alive, divorce was discouraged. The law greatly discouraged divorce. Now, in the Western world, it is much easier to secure a divorce. And of course, we now have a gay rights movement. No such thing existed in Freud's part of the world when he was alive. And the question arises, would Freud approve of these changes? Would Freud approve of the idea that there is no stigma attached to illegitimacy or living together or divorce, and that we now have a gay rights movement? We can only speculate, of course. My speculation is this. I think in general he would approve of all of those things. Having said that, though, and again I'm speculating, having said that, I do not think he would find American society, I do not think he would believe that American society has a mature approach to sex. And let me tell you why. Freud, time and again, said that sex should not be looked upon as the be-all and end-all of life. Sex should not be looked upon as the be-all and end-all of life. It should not be looked upon as the primary source of happiness. Freud believed that. Sex should not be looked upon as the primary source of happiness. So my guess is, if Freud visited the U.S. today, and he did visit the U.S. in 1909, by the way, he was given an honorary degree at Clark University. If Freud were to visit the United States today, my guess is, and again I can only guess, he would say the Americans had an immature attitude towards sex when I visited them, and he did say that, and they still have an immature attitude towards sex, even though so many of their customs have changed. Freud believed that the sex drive in its mature form is an achievement. Freud believed that very few people reach the stage where they have a mature attitude towards sex. He believed the majority of people never reach that stage. So Freud believed that most people, when it comes to sex, are rather immature. Freud did advocate, as I mentioned, Freud did advocate a much more liberal approach to sexuality. And let me give you his own words. In his 40s, when Freud was in his 40s, in a letter to a friend, he wrote this, and I'm quoting Freud: "I stand for an infinitely freer sexual life, although I myself have made very little use of such freedom." The question comes up, what is the proper role of sex in life? What is the proper role of sex in life? And in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud says this: "Man's discovery that sexual genital love afforded him the strongest experiences of satisfaction must have suggested to him that he should make genital eroticism the central point of his life." But Freud goes on to say this: the wise men of every age have warned us most emphatically against this way of life. But in spite of this, it has not lost its attraction for a great number of people. So Freud is saying the wise men of all ages have said, do not make sexual satisfaction the central point of your life. But Freud goes on to say, despite this advice, most people, or a lot of people, I don't know that Freud said most, but that many people do make the desire for sexual satisfaction the central point of their life. I think if one had interviewed Freud on this matter, and if you had asked him, well, what's more important than sex? What are greater sources of happiness than sex? I can say with some confidence that Freud would probably say among those sources of satisfaction that are greater than sex are acquiring knowledge, loving people, and trying to be a just human being. I think you would add to that list, but those would be among them. Acquiring knowledge and trying to be a loving human being, that one can get more satisfaction in life from those aspects of living than from sex. Freud talked about homosexuality. He wrote about sexual perversions. He had a rather uncensorious attitude towards what we would call sexual perversions. And in 1935, an American woman whose son was a homosexual wrote him a letter. Remember, Freud understood English, spoke English as well as German. German was his first language, of course. But in this letter, she expressed her pain that her son was homosexual. And she wanted advice from this great doctor. And the letter he wrote back to her has become rather famous. So here is Freud writing to the mother of a young American homosexual, writing in English. And here's what he says: "Homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of. No vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function produced by a certain arrest of sexual development." Homosexuals probably pay a lot of attention to those last few words, because on the one hand, Freud is saying homosexuality is not an illness, and a homosexual should not be ashamed of being a homosexual. On the other hand, he's saying, in his opinion, it is evidence of an arrest of sexual development. He goes on to say in this letter that many, and I'm quoting Freud, many highly respectable individuals of ancient and modern times have been homosexuals. Several of the greatest among them, Plato, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. It is a great injustice to persecute homosexuality as a crime, and a great cruelty too. Again, that last sentence, these are Freud's own words. It is a great injustice to persecute homosexuality as a crime, and a cruelty too. As you know, for a very long time, homosexual activity was considered to be a crime. One could be arrested in many countries of the world for engaging in homosexual practices. Freud, in his book entitled 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, talks about what he considers to be perversions. And he defines a perversion very broadly. Basically, in his opinion, a perversion is a sexual act that does not involve intercourse. Let me give you examples. Well, he mentioned homosexuality as a perversion, but he said this, and I'm quoting Freud. He said, homosexuality scarcely deserves the label perversion. Those are Freud's own words. Homosexuality scarcely deserves the label perversion. He mentions early on that all of us, in his opinion, have tendencies towards perversion. Sorry to inform you of that. In fact, he says that sexual impulses are among the least controlled by the mind. Sexual impulses are among the least controlled by... I was thinking about Benjamin Franklin when he said this. In fact, PBS had a program on Ben Franklin last night. It is true that Ben Franklin, in his autobiography, confessed to having frequent liaisons with prostitutes as a young man. And he said he was very fearful because he was fearful of catching a venereal disease. And Franklin came to the conclusion that he shouldn't be doing this. He said that his mind told him that he should not be engaging in liaisons with prostitutes. But Franklin, in his autobiography, went on to say this, and I'm quoting Benjamin Franklin. He said, at times, inclination was too strong for reason. Inclination was too strong for reason. And that illustrates Freud's idea very well, that our sexual drive, our sexual instinct, is one of the most difficult to control. Among the perversions, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, he lists sadism, masochism, oral sex, fetishism, exhibitionism, and voyeurism, all as perversions. But again, he goes on to say there is some perversion in everyone. Let me give you his own words. He says, a disposition to perversions of every kind is a general and fundamental human characteristic. A disposition to perversions of every kind is a general and fundamental human characteristic. He goes on to say this. Inappropriate it is to use the word perversion as a term of reproach. Pretty powerful language. Let me say that again. Freud's own words. Inappropriate it is to use the word perversion as a term of reproach. Now you might wonder, did he believe any perversions were a sign of pathology, a sign of illness? Yes, he did. I'm not going to mention them now because they're not the kinds of things you would want to talk about in public. But he is specific. He is specific in saying that several perversions would be indications of a sick mind. I will tell you this. He says that the perversions I've already addressed myself to, they could be a sign of pathology. Sadism, masochism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, oral sex, they could be a sign of perversion if they had the characteristic of exclusiveness and fixation. Exclusiveness and fixation. But if one is not fixated on those perversions I enumerated, if one is not engaging in those perversions to the exclusion of what we would call normal sex, intercourse, well then he would say there's probably no problem. So again, to summarize this segment of my lecture, it's often been said, and accurately so, that in general, Freud had a rather uncensorious attitude towards what we would label perversions. Again, whether we're talking about homosexuality or oral sex or exhibitionism, those kinds of perversions. I mentioned before that Freud found himself the victim of vitriolic opposition. Adler became a bitter enemy of his. Jung became a bitter enemy of his. And you might wonder, how did Jung and Adler differ from Freud? How is Jungian psychology different from Freudian psychology? How is Adlerian psychology different from Freudian psychology? Let's take Adler first. Adler believed, Alfred Adler, a great psychiatrist, at least many believe he was, Alfred Adler believed that most neuroses were not connected to sex. He believed that most neuroses were related to our feelings of inferiority. Adler believed that virtually all people, if not all people, have inferiority complexes. We all have some feelings of inferiority, and we all engage in devices of compensating for those feelings. And Adler believed that very often we engage in misguided efforts to compensate for our inferiority, and that leads to neurosis, not sex. Jung kind of synthesizes Freud and Adler. Jung's idea was, Siggy, I think sometimes you're right. Sometimes neurosis is related to sex. But Alfred Adler, I think sometimes you're right, that sometimes neurosis is related to people's feelings of inferiority. And also there are other causes of neurosis. One of the main ways in which Jung differed from Freud was that Jung did not accept the historical notion of neurosis that Freud believed, that you had to examine one's childhood. If you were an analyst, you must examine the patient's childhood. Jung said, well, sometimes you have to, other times you don't. Depends on the nature of the neurosis. But it should not be an ironclad rule that when a patient comes to you with a neurosis that you must spend a lot of time, maybe any time, talking about the person's childhood, because it might not have much relevance to the person's present neurotic behavior. What I want to do now is to spend a little time talking about psychoanalysis. Since Freud is considered to be the founder of psychoanalysis, I want to spend some time on this. Freud defined psychoanalysis as the science of unconscious mental processes. The science of unconscious mental processes. He divided the mind into three interacting agencies: the ego, the superego, and the id. The ego is that part of us that is most in contact with the external world. It is the ego in us that the ego in us that is responsible for our reasoning. It's responsible for our capacities to calculate, to plan. The ego is the mind's eyes and ears. The ego most immediately controls thoughts and behavior. Again, the ego most immediately controls thoughts and behavior. The superego consists of really two dimensions. The superego consists of the conscience, but it also consists of unconscious feelings of guilt that Freud believed that very often we feel guilty, but we don't know that we feel guilty, and that these guilt feelings are expressed through illness, through mental illness, if not physical illness. So again, the superego consists of the conscience and unconscious feelings of guilt. The id is the source of our passions and the source of our drives. The id is the source of our aggressive instinct. It's the source of our sexual instinct. It is the source of our hunger instinct. It is the source of our selfish passions. It is the source of our sadistic impulses. The id. It is totally unconscious. The id, besides containing our drives and our passions and a lot of nasty stuff, the id also contains our repressed desires. That as we grow, we repress certain desires. We repress certain thoughts, and they all go into the id. And according to Freud, the id can cause us great problems. That a lot of our neurotic behavior, all of our neurotic behavior actually, in one way or another, is related to the id. I want to give a short example that might illustrate how the id, superego, and ego work. Let's assume that someone has a desire for unusual sex, kinky sex, someone might say. Well, that desire emanates from the id, this desire for kinky sex. Well, your superego, your conscience says, how horrible. I want to engage in these kinds of practices. I've even had fantasies about doing this. How horrible. The ego now addresses itself to, in a certain sense, addresses itself to the superego and the id. And the superego's response is, I'm afraid. Again, the id, I want kinky sex. The superego, how horrible. The ego, I'm afraid. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid that I want to have kinky sex. That's what I am afraid of. And this can cause all kinds of conflicts. And this is just one illustration of a kind of problem that could result in a neurosis. Freud believed that the intention of psychoanalysis is where id was, their ego should be. Shall be, excuse me. I'm quoting Freud. Again, you might wonder, what's the whole purpose of psychoanalysis? What's the purpose of the person lying on the couch and talking to an analyst. Again, Freud says the purpose of this is where id was, ego shall be. What does that mean? What it means was what was unconscious shall be made conscious. Freud believed that if we can bring to consciousness so much of what's going on in the id, so many of the conflicts that are taking place in the id, if we can bring it to consciousness, that will provide relief for us. And we'll have more energy to live our daily lives. We will not be devoting so much energy to repressing something, because he does say it requires an awful lot of energy to repress. And Freud believed that if you could make conscious what was unconscious, if you could make conscious what was unconscious, among the results would be this. You'd have more awareness of your shadow, meaning more awareness of some of the more objectionable aspects of human nature. You'd have more self-control. You would be less impulsive. You'd have a greater ability to delay gratification. You'd be more tranquil, and you'd have more energy. All of this, Freud believed, would be the result of psychoanalysis, would be the result of making conscious what was unconscious. What I would like to do now is to talk about Freud's last years. You know that the Nazis took over Austria. I think it was 1937. Freud was living in Vienna. Many people advised him to leave. He did not at first. But things got so bad, he had no alternative. And when it came time for him to leave, there was some anxiety about whether the Nazis would allow his family to leave. And Peter Gay and other biographers have concluded that it was the American government that was primarily responsible for Freud getting out of Vienna, that the American government put great pressure on the Austrian Nazis to let him go. Freud was 82 years old, and they did let him go, he and his family, his immediate family, and they went to Paris for a very short time and then on to London. And Freud celebrated his 83rd birthday in London, and about a year after leaving Vienna, he died. And I mentioned his death was an assisted suicide. Dr. Shore was the assisting physician. Freud didn't want to live anymore. The cancer he had been battling for 16 years was causing him tremendous pain. He had a prosthesis in his mouth for those 16 years, separating his oral cavity from his nasal cavity. At times he had trouble talking. He could no longer lecture the way he once did in his prime. And again, he was in so much pain, he asked the doctor to put an end to it all. And the doctor gave him several overdoses of morphine. And Freud died at 3 in the morning on September the 23rd, 1939, at the age of 83. Freud had 4 sisters who were left behind in Vienna. When Freud died, he did not know the fate of those 4 sisters. But of course, we know the fate. All 4 of his sisters who were left behind in Vienna died in concentration camps. What I would like to do now is to bring this all together. The title of the lecture is Freud's Lessons, and let me express to you what I think are some of Freud's significant lessons. One of Freud's lessons, I think, is that we human beings are very complex creatures, that at times we're rational, other times we're irrational. We are ambivalent creatures. Freud loved that word ambivalent, the German word for ambivalent. Freud said, where there is love, there is almost always hatred. He said, in our most intimate relationships, where there is love, there is hatred. Freud believed there was only one relationship that might have been free of hatred, and that is the relationship of mother to son, mother to son. Freud also believed at times we are calm, other times we're nervous. Sometimes we're confident, sometimes we're afraid. Sometimes we're selfish, sometimes we're altruistic. He believed the mind is a battleground, that it is not unusual that we find ourselves in conflict with ourselves. You know, the Buddha said, much of your pain is self-chosen. Freud agreed with that. Much of our pain is self-chosen. Pascal, the famous French philosopher, said there are 2 natures in us, one good and one bad. Freud believed that. He said, if you don't believe me, take a look at the id. Not easy to do, by the way, take a look at the id. But I mentioned that's the source of our instincts and our sadistic impulses and passions. Carl Sagan, famous professor of science, the late Carl Sagan, who taught at Cornell, Carl Sagan referred to the reptilian core. The reptilian core, according to Carl Sagan, is that kernel of savagery in us, left untouched by the process of evolution. And Freud said, look at what these people are doing to each other in World War I. Look at what people are doing to each other in World War I, and you think we're gentle creatures. I think Sagan perhaps also might have used that as proof. Socrates said, there is much imbalance in all people. There is much imbalance in all people. Freud subscribed to that idea. Another lesson, I think, is that self-deception is a prominent characteristic of people. Denial, repression, lying to ourselves is not uncommon, and that these are obstacles to self-fulfillment. That when we lie to ourselves, we're not helping ourselves. When we deny reality, we're not helping ourselves. We are hurting ourselves. Freud believed the truth will make us free. And it's interesting, who first said, as far as we know, or at least who's been quoted as saying the truth will make us free? Jesus has been quoted as saying that. So it's interesting, the atheist, Freud, agrees with Jesus, whom some people look to as God, that the truth will make us free. Of course, they weren't talking about the same truths. Although, in one way they were, because I think it's fair to say that both Jesus and Freud, I know it's fair to say that both Jesus and Freud believed it's very important for human beings to confront the shadow in them. It's very important that we not think we're better people than we are, better creatures than we are. It's very important that we not scapegoat and say the blacks are, the Jews are, gays are, women are, that maybe we have some of the same traits. Maybe we have some of the same traits. It's called projection, by the way. In fact, it is interesting. Freud's daughter, Anna, who later became a psychoanalyst, was interviewed by the Nazis, had to go and submit to an interview. She took a poison pill. I think I might have told you this before. Took a poison pill with her, intending to commit suicide if they were going to torture her. And she said, it's interesting. The Nazis kept talking about how pushy Jews are, how aggressive Jews are, how rude Jews are. And she said, all this time, my interviewers were being rude and aggressive and nasty. They were doing exactly what they were accusing the Jews of doing. And again, Freud said this is not unusual. We often project onto other people what we don't want to face in ourselves. Also, Freud stimulates us to think about the purposes of life. What are the purposes of life? Well, according to Freud, among the purposes of life are acquiring greater self-knowledge and engaging in self-realization. And what does self-realization involve? Self-realization involves self-conquest, self-mastery. And what does that mean? Self-mastery means gaining ever greater control over our emotions. Self-mastery involves gaining ever greater control over our emotions. And Freud believed that's one of the great purposes of living. Freud, again, one of his lessons, he believed our sexual desires can never be fully satisfied. He believed that sublimation is essential to the good life. It's very important we channel a lot of our sexual energy into other activities. He believed that self-knowledge and self-fulfillment go hand in hand. Self-knowledge and self-fulfillment go hand in hand. He believed ignorance is not bliss. What you don't know can hurt you. What you don't know can hurt you. He believed that self-knowledge is indispensable for improving our relationships. Self-knowledge is indispensable for improving our relationships. The better you understand yourself, the better you understand your wife. The better you understand yourself, the better you understand your children, your students, your co-workers. What were the criteria of mental health? What were Freud's criteria for judging whether somebody was in mental health? Well, Freud told the late Erik Erikson, I have two criteria for determining whether somebody is in good mental health. Can they love and can they work? If a person is capable of loving and is capable of work, that's a pretty good indication they're in reasonably good mental health. Finally, Freud believed that insight is a prerequisite to living a happier life. Insight is a prerequisite to living a happier life. The Greeks were right. Know thyself. Remember that ancient Greek maxim, know thyself. And Freud would say, they got it right. Also, Freud and many religionists have much in common in this sense, that so many prominent religious thinkers and Freud agree that we must confront the potential for evil in us and try to be decent, loving people. Again, Freud agreed with many famous religious people that we must confront the potential for evil in us and try to be decent, loving people. This is essential to achieving better mental health. I'd like to conclude with two quotations, one from the writer Willie Morris, who I think in a certain sense sums up Freudianism pretty well. Willie Morris has said this: "The gentlest person is that person who has battled the most against his or her inner violence." I'll say it again. The gentlest person is that person who has battled the most against his or her inner violence. And finally, a quotation from Bertrand Russell, a great philosopher and someone who did admire Sigmund Freud. Russell was a mathematician and a philosopher. Bertrand Russell said this, it's one of my favorite quotes of all time: "Neither love without knowledge, nor knowledge without love can produce a good life." Let me say it again, because it's worth saying again. Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, said this: "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. Neither love without knowledge, nor knowledge without love can produce a good life." I thank you very much.